It's time for episode 89 of The Crisis Show here on Google Hangouts, on YouTube, and wherever else you have this link around the world. Good evening and Happy New Year from New York State. My name is Rich Klein. I'm founder and host of The Crisis Show and president of Rich Klein Crisis Management. Lots to talk about tonight in this new year. I'm pleased to have, once again on The Crisis Show, two esteemed guests. They've been with us before, and together they're a good team. That's why I invited them together. First of all, from St. Louis, Missouri, Trip Froeligstein. Hey, Trip, how are you?
I am well, thank you. Thanks for inviting us both, I think, and I hope that this is a good session for all of the people watching.
Thank you for that. And from Greenwich, Connecticut, one of my speaking and presentation mentors, a media training and celebrity media training coach, Ruth Sherman. How are you, Ruth?
I'm real good, Rich. Happy New Year. Hey, Trip.
Hi, Ruth.
So for those of you watching, we apologize for the late start. We had a technical difficulty. We hope it's cleared up. You never know with Google Hangouts. Anyway, we're going to start out tonight with the breaking news, of course, that everyone is focused on, which is this tragedy in Paris, this shooting of a satirical magazine in which 10 people were killed and plus 2 police officers. And once again, a tragic reminder of the world we live in, of course, and we're not trying to solve the world's problems on this show, but we do talk about leadership and what are the right messages for leaders to put out there immediate aftermath of crises like these. So I turn to my two esteemed panelists here, Trip and Ruth, just to maybe chime in a little bit about some of the things that you see when these things happen. What should business, government, organizational leaders be thinking about in their own media training, in their own spokespeople training when situations like this happen? And either one of you can start.
Well, if I may just jump right in, Rich, on this horrible situation in Paris, and from being from New York, you and I, it just seems never to end, right? But you mentioned the operative word, and that was training. People need to review their crisis plans. You need to do it every 6 months at a minimum, and they don't do it. They don't do it. So whereas I was happy to see that François Hollande, was obviously making his way back to Paris or to the scene, which is the appropriate thing for the leader to do. That's probably as far as it's going to get in terms of what's going on behind the scenes right now. So, training and preparation is really the key to managing these types of, to the extent they can be managed.
Yeah, Trip, feel free, and I'll add something too.
I actually think that there are some interesting and good things that happened here, and there are some good lessons. Whether or not you've practiced, and you should, Ruth is absolutely right. One of the keys that we always say, and it's become even more true in this day of Twitter. In fact, right now 40 new tweets about the Paris shooting have come since I turned my head just about a minute ago. So they're tweeting about it a lot. Speed is important. It's a weapon, if you will, and that's why it's smart that the president of France did quickly get to the scene. In fact, and we may have time to talk about it later, but if you look at the Air Asia situation, their CEO was very quickly on the scene and involved in their crisis situation after the crash of the plane near Indonesia. So I think that that's one of the things in a crisis like this you do want to remember as a leader, and that is you got to react quickly. People want leadership, and you can see in Paris 100,000 people showed up. The pictures, if you see them online, massive amounts of people. So leadership has an opportunity here to really do something good for the people. It's a tragic event, it's terrible, but out of that can come maybe some unity, although Ruth and I were talking in the green room beforehand about the idea that a lot of times leaders will squander this too, and I think part of the idea of a crisis is making sure, how do you keep that leadership going and keep the unity? Right now, all French people are just French people. They're not men, women, they're races, even religions. They are French people, just as we were briefly after the 9/11 situation happened here. Unfortunately, our leadership at the time didn't keep us together, if you will.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Thank you both for those insights. One of the things that people expect, they expect the presidents of countries and government officials close to the scene to be the spokespeople. But for those of you out there in business, these things have a domino effect. So if I'm a business person in France today, it's not just what you're saying to the media, or it's also really important that for internal purposes that you talk to your staff and you let them know that it's going to be okay, and get crisis counseling if need be. There's a lot of people get affected by these things, and what I've seen all too often in these situations, I will get a call, and you guys get them too, and the CEO or the spokesperson is only concerned about their public face. And what I always tell them is, you also have to worry about other critical audiences when these things happen. There's a domino effect that especially the larger the company, the more people in your family, so to speak. So it's also really important to get the messaging right, whether it's through a memo or a speech you give to your staff, to your employees. But you really need to show that compassion and sensitivity. That's got to come fast and effectively in the immediate aftermath of this situation. So if you guys can chime in on that too, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, well, it's just to piggyback on what Tripp said, certainly, and what you just said too, Rich. The idea that a leader gives voice to all the anxieties and fears and need for comfort that the current the population has in the wake of such an event like this. So, Tripp, your point about the quickness, being able to be there quickly, being nimble. Very smart, for people to do that. So Rich and Tripp totally agree with that. The other thing too, and this goes to what you were saying earlier, Tripp, as well, is that if you don't react, someone else will. So if you don't take the lead, then if you don't tell the story, someone else is going to tell it for you, and it's not going to be the story you want. So certainly for those in those lessons. In this incident, those are lessons that we can find, for sure.
We'll be talking about Ferguson later, and that what you just said was so true in Ferguson, but we'll get there in a bit. I think another point that you mentioned, Rich, in terms of leadership, is the idea that leadership also of companies, I'm getting the corporate thing, has to be careful about what their company does during a crisis. We hear time and time again inappropriate tweets. If a travel agency today were tweeting travel to Paris for a romantic evening, that wouldn't be a very smart kind of thing given what's going on there now. So they really do have to think about the impact of a crisis that may have literally no effect directly on a company, and yet a company can get drawn into it. We've seen that happen a lot with
we absolutely have
sensitive tweets.
That's a great point, Tripp. Thank you for bringing that up. And that really just goes to my original point about the domino effect. There's other issues that come up in these things that can become a crisis that you didn't intend. So I appreciate that. Okay, so we were talking about, since we're talking about leadership, I want to make sort of a little bit of a logical transition here, because the next thing we're going to talk about is the death of Mario Cuomo, who I had the honor of covering as a Cub reporter back in the early 80s. It was my first journalism job / internship, and when he became governor, and he really was an amazing person to watch, to observe, and speaking. The first thing I want to do, though, is play a clip from his very notable, for those out there who may be too young or haven't heard it, it's worth listening because he really conveyed leadership here. Now, even though this was not one of these kinds of crisis situations, when he spoke in 1984 at the Democratic National Convention, it was a crisis in the terms of the Democrats having a voice to oppose what Ronald Reagan was saying. And so I think it's really important in that way, in terms of recapturing some of the Democratic ideas in the way only Mario Cuomo could do. And I know I'm going to call on Ruth in a minute to talk about that. But let's, first of all, listen to a little bit of this audio, and then we'll talk about it.
Please allow me to skip the stories and the poetry and the temptation to deal in nice but vague rhetoric. Let me instead use this valuable opportunity to deal immediately with the questions that should determine this election and that we all know are vital to the American people. 10 days ago, President Reagan admitted that although some people in this country seem to be doing well nowadays, others were unhappy, even worried about themselves, their families, and their futures. president said that he didn't understand that fear. He said, "Why, this country is a shining city on a hill." And the president is right. In many ways, we are a shining city on a hill. But the hard truth is that not everyone is sharing in this city's splendor and glory. A shining city is perhaps all the president sees from the portico of the White House and the veranda of his ranch, where everyone seems to be doing well. But there's another city. There's another part to the shining city. The part where some people can't pay their mortgages, and most young people can't afford one. Where students can't afford the education they need, and middle-class parents watch the dreams they hold for their children evaporate. In this part of the city, there are more poor than ever, more families in trouble, more and more people who need help but can't find it. Even worse, there are elderly people who tremble in the basements of the houses there. And there are people who sleep in the city's streets, in the gutter, where the glitter doesn't show. There are ghettos where thousands of young people without a job or an education give their lives away to drug dealers every day. There is despair, Mr. President, in the faces that you don't see, in the places that you don't visit, in your shining city.
Okay, I'll just hold it there just to give people a flavor. Let me bring myself back here. Ruth, you're a fan of Mario Cuomo as a speaker. I mean, I think I said to you in the green room, and you and I both been fans of Steve Jobs, but on the government side, I don't think there was any better person as an orator. What do you think?
No, he's one of the greats, and as a communication speech professional, I'm gonna miss him. I'm gonna miss him. I've missed him. I've missed his public communication since he stepped away. Mario Cuomo was great. In fact, this week's newsletters, the subject line is "The Electrifying Mario Cuomo." The Mario Cuomo did something that very few people do very well, and that is he was able to make his material come alive by telling stories and making you feel you were there. You were there. You could. It was a very visual. It was a very visual way of storytelling. So, for example, when he was talking about the two cities, right? This speech is known as the Tale of Two Cities, right? That's the nickname. He's talking about the shining city on a hill, of course, which is the Reagan term, and then he talks about, well, there's another city. There's the city where people are having trouble paying their mortgages, etc., and the people are poorer than ever. There are people who are sleeping in the gutter, and you're there. You're watching. You're seeing this. You're able to envision it because it's within his audience's experience.
Interesting.
So he made sure that he addressed situations that were and created language around them that were within his audience's experiences so that they could be there with him. And what you'll also notice, how early is this in the speech, what you just played, Rich?
It was really the beginning of it. I know there's a lot.
Yeah. He starts really kind of slow. He gets really revved up. I mean, the crowd goes wild. By the time he gets, halfway through and to the end, it's like they can't control themselves any longer. So he starts really slow. He builds this sort of this wave, right? And then you are riding the crest of that wave with him, and you pretty much stay up there until he makes his last comment, his final comment. I happen to think that his '92 speech, the nominating speech for Bill Clinton, was a better speech. You'll also notice in the second speech that he started to reduce his Queen's accent a little bit. Because he was thinking of running for president by that time. But he was one of the best at building those stories around people's experiences and also using metaphor. Lots of metaphor in his language. So in the '92 speech, for example, he talked a lot about the ship of state. Right. Talked about the ship of state, and George Bush was the captain of the ship of state, and he was waiting for some, how did he put it? Some current, some God-given current to bring the economic gods to bring it around to make sure that it's sailing in the right direction. It's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. No, I thought I'd share it. I mean, it was certainly a big loss to those of us who live in New York. He certainly was an inspiration to a lot of people, and certainly as someone who writes speeches sometimes and looks at not just how the speech is delivered, but the written word. It's clear, Ruth, that he paid attention to the written word and then made it just sing. So a very interesting character, certainly, and a great man who will be missed. So I want to move on now to our next topic, another one, another New York story that's gone national, folks, and that is this continuing controversy between New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio and the New York Police Department. The story really started out as a protest story regarding the death in Staten Island, New York, of Eric Garner, who there was a chokehold by one of the officers, and this resulted in a lot of anger following Ferguson, following Trayvon Martin, and they took to the streets. What happened then was there was a small group that started calling for death to the cops. We don't know how many, but apparently it was a very small group, but it got a lot of media attention. And that led to the police being upset because they felt that this mayor didn't speak out loudly and clearly against this kind of speech, calling for the deaths of police officers. And then, of course, the tragedy that followed was this crazy person who came up from Baltimore, Maryland, and executed 2 officers on patrol, sitting in their patrol car in Brooklyn, New York. And since then, at these funerals, the police officers have, not all of them, some of them have turned their backs whenever the mayor has appeared. And this has caused a great rift between the NYPD and de Blasio, but also Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. So, Ruth, I want to talk to you a little bit about this. Bill Bratton obviously is no Mario Cuomo, but what can he do, if anything, to become a better communicator, to get this crisis under control? It's a very serious crisis when you've lost the trust of the NYPD, a good amount of them, and then you have on top of that a very volatile union leader, Patrick Lynch, who basically right after these 2 murders of the police officers blamed the mayor directly. So where do you go from here? How would you advise him?
Well, both de Blasio and Bratton have now put themselves out there publicly in asking the police for their indulgence, right? To certainly Bratton, there was a big publicity thing around their meeting that he had with the police. I think it was Monday, right? Monday, or I don't know when it was.
He also sent a memo out, basically saying, "Hey, you have the right to free speech, but out of respect for these officers, don't turn your backs."
Right. Well, right. There are a number of things going on. Clearly, the cops are really angry, and they're being egged on by who knows who. Patrick Lynch is one of these, like you said, he's a pretty, he's a loudmouth, right? He's one of these loudmouth union guys. But in any event, the problem is now not only have the police pushed it a little bit too far, they've pushed it too far. The people are feeling the fact that the police have not made, we were talking earlier, Rich, that there's a difference between speech and action. So speech is turning your back on the mayor. That's speech. It's protected. They can do it. It doesn't look good. I wish they didn't do it, but they're doing it, right? Okay, fine. It's not going to hurt anybody. But what they've also done is they have stopped arresting people for small offenses pretty dramatically. The last 2 weeks have seen almost a 90+% drop off in what do they call them? Window breaking kinds of crimes, right? Turnstile jumping, carrying open carry, right? Yeah. Right. Those kinds, right? Carrying liquor. We're not even talking about guns. We don't have guns, and people don't carry guns in New York City, but beer in a bag, right, or something. No parking tickets, right? So arrests have dropped. That's action. That makes people feel unsafe.
Oh, by the way, the parking tickets I'm glad about, but that's another story.
Okay, well that's fine. To each his own, Rich. That's fine.
Too many of them, but that's a whole other story.
I get you.
It's all for revenue, but
you and everybody else I've been reading about But what's going on now is that unless both De Blasio and Bratton take control, and by that I mean, heads are going to have to roll. Heads are going to have to roll. Somebody's going to have to take the leadership. They look weak. I mean, if Bratton publicly says to the police before the funeral, you're welcome to do what you want. However, here's what I would like. I'm the commissioner.
Right.
And here's what I'd like. And Bratton's he's a pretty straightforward guy. Nobody's talking about Bill Bratton as a weakling.
Right.
And they ignore him, there's a problem.
Yeah, and he's really caught between a rock and a hard place because he's got to be loyal to the mayor and loyal to the rank and file. Very tough situation. Yeah.
I don't think he does have to be loyal to the rank and file. I don't think either of them are loyal to. They're loyal to the citizens who voted for them.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. Only because maybe the wrong word's loyalty, but he has to show support for his rank and file. He has to show support. I think he's got a very tough job right now navigating that. De Blasio's got the bigger responsibility of showing the leadership. He's being asked to apologize for things. He's not going to do it. He's actually very angry at all this, and I don't know if that's the right reaction either. But
I don't think he should be angry either. I mean, I agree with you that anger is not the best. It's not the best way to work. But somebody's got to take control. They've got to keep the emotional stuff out of it at this point, and say, all right, you guys aren't doing your job.
Right.
That's what's happening. They're not doing their job. They're being paid. They're not doing their job. That's a problem.
And they're kind of and the NYPD people who are doing this, whether it's being egged on by the union or not, like you said earlier, Ruth, they were winning public opinion initially, but now it's gone above and beyond. They've gone past that point of winning that public opinion. It's probably going to turn the other way if they keep doing things like this. I think, especially as you say, if there are violent crimes that are not stopped or prosecuted or arrests aren't made, then you have a public safety issue and you have a city out of control. We're not there yet, thank God, but let's hope that doesn't happen. Yeah, Tripp, I was just going to get to you about some of the links to Ferguson, but go ahead.
No, this has nothing to do with Ferguson yet, but what is really interesting is, as I listen to this discussion, a reminder that I'm sitting here in the Midwest, and we don't have all the details you do. Even if you watch the national news shows, which I do, some of those are there, but you're getting a lot more coverage, and it's a lot more granular for you. Because here, for example, I was with a group of people, and everybody was talking about how disrespectful and awful the New York cops were, because here is the funeral of their slain, fallen comrade, and they're playing politics instead of letting the world focus on this guy. So there's a very negative feeling toward the New York Police Department, and de Blasio kind of gets a pass here. It's like, because all the details of what happened when don't get past the tri-state area, and therefore the rest of the country is viewing it differently. Now, that may not matter, but it's just an interesting perspective to see how we view it in a much higher level and a much simpler level than you do, because we don't live it.
No, yeah. It's a great point, and it's definitely, it kind of just reaffirms what we just said, is that, and also because of the news cycle. That's the latest part of the news cycle. The NYPD turning their backs. Anything that happened before now is old news, and that's what they're focused on. So it's a great point. But let's talk about Ferguson, because, and for our viewers' benefit, Tripp has done some media training with the St. Louis City Police, the County Police, and the Highway Patrol, and he's I think you're about 12 miles from Ferguson, so you're very close to everything that's happened there. But maybe you could start off, before we get into some of that, talk to us about what the latest happenings in Ferguson right now. Are the protests every day? Are they more sporadic now? What's the community saying? Just give us a kind of an aerial view, and then we'll get some details.
They are far more sporadic, but they're out there. Their coverage is less. The media, local media, has kind of moved on, although I just looked at Twitter, and in the last about 2 minutes, there have been 54 new Ferguson posts. So now, not all of them are related to the events, but most of them still are. And some people now are linking Ferguson and Paris and all these tragedies like that. But yeah, there are still some protests. There have also, by the way, been some positive stories that have really been pushed by officials in Ferguson and others, such as how artists have come in and taken the boarded up buildings and at least done murals and things on those buildings to try to did bring some semblance of beauty and the past back in that sense. But we also have a commission of people that are meeting. So far, they've accomplished very little other than decide, and there's pretty universal agreement in the St. Louis area about this, that all these municipalities that are in the north side, North County area, north of the city and the north half of the county, have been existing for one reason, and that is to give tickets or fines to people, and that's how they exist. So there is talk about and there's both Republicans and Democrats agree on this one, interestingly, that it's time to stop letting communities exist so that they can simply exist by traffic fines, in other words, and we may see a change in that. But there's still some tension in the air. There are still people concerned about what might happen, but it pretty well has died down compared to what it was. And one more thing to remind people, the whole St. Louis area did not explode, even though it may have looked like that. There were small pockets, and it's just like in so many other types of crises. Ferguson is the area that happened in was very small. In fact, just right outside where it happened, there are a lot of people in Ferguson who live in neighborhoods who are 2 blocks away and said, other than the fact that we heard sirens and saw smoke, you wouldn't have known that things were happening. It was still peaceful in their neighborhoods, and little pockets of St. Louis where it would happen. But very, very, very few people were affected. And I only say that because I can't tell you how many people called and said, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Yeah, like you said, I'm 12 miles away, but that might as well be 100 miles away because nothing happened here. So anyway, it has calmed down greatly. People are still talking about it. Is it going to lead anywhere? It goes back to what Ruth said before, by the way. One more thing, and that is, will it keep going? And the answer seems to be no. It's kind of beginning to fade away, and other things are beginning to take its place. Right now, the big news today is it's 6 degrees right now here.
Yeah. Hey, Trip, very interesting that you said that, because the way I view it in terms of whether it's faded away is that it's just taken up in a new place. So it's now in New York, for example.
True. That's a good point.
Right?
The whole incident there with the guy on video being choked, which, of course, started a lot of this whole thing for Blasio, which, by the way, may have been another problem. I think, Rich, I don't know if you said this on the air, we talked about it earlier, but I think you were right that, once again, speed was an issue. He did not come out firmly against what happened in those situations quickly enough, so the cops got mad at him.
Yeah, and just for our viewers' benefit who are not in New York, and maybe for you, Trip, as well, during this campaign, there was this whole policy of stop and search, which he did away with, and this was kind of even before, from the day he took office, this was an issue with the cops, so with the rank and file. So, and then when this happened, and when the people were, and by the way, it was, I just have to say this, editorialize for a second, when you watch these protests and you watch these police officers who are the targets of these protests, managing traffic, making sure the protesters are safe, it's just amazing how they keep their composure against all those protesters who are, saying the worst things about them. I have to give them a lot of credit in their training, because I just, somebody keeps calling you a name is right in your face, It's just amazing how their training kicks in, and we have a job to do. So I give them a lot of credit. But there is a small minority out there of officers that like the ones who turn their backs, and the ones who are maybe too aggressive, that has led to a lot of this media coverage. Just like on the protest side, there was a very small minority who said the most vicious things, who called for the deaths of police officers, and this is what got everybody fired up. So it's really interesting there too.
Identical here in St. Louis with us. The same thing with our cops. There were a few, by the way, and in fact, a couple got fired because one of the other things about a crisis or this kind of situation is the citizen journalist, right? The one who has their little iPhone here, and it's real easy to send that stuff out. That's what a lot of the pictures from Paris that I'm seeing on Twitter, they're not network pictures. They're pictures that people are taking about looking at all the crowds and the people who are gathered there. And I think that's another factor that people have to remember in a crisis nowadays, is that it's not just even the regular media anymore. It's the social media, the people who have their little iPhones or their Samsungs or whatever brand you happen to have. And that also exacerbates the problem very often for people, because you look at Twitter, for example, during the Ferguson riots, and you see all of these feeds that are coming in, and it really looked like the earth was ending here.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I know there's been calls around the country for police officers to wear cameras. So if there is something wrong, it can be recorded. On the other hand, I think it also would, when they're falsely accused, give them protection. So it's a
Yes.
very interesting conversation that's going on in communities around the country. But certainly, I think it's clear that we are all under a microscope, police officers especially in this situation, but we are all under a microscope today in public because of the things you put out, because of citizen journalism and the iPhone and other cameras that could record
Yeah.
everything. Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing too, that I want to make really clear, I'm sure you'll agree with me, Rich, is that we in the New York area love the NYPD.
Yeah.
We think the NYPD, we think those police officers are amazing, and to see them reduced to, these sort of petty behaviors right now it's like a family member who's gone astray, right, Rich? Don't you think? I love the police officers. I like saying hello to them. I feel good when they're in my neighborhood. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, even today, I put a video on my Facebook feed. There was another shooting in the Bronx that was not about these protests. At least early reporting has not shown that. And one of the news stations took video of one of these officers who was wounded leaving the hospital, and just lines of officers, saluting him and clapping for him as he left the hospital. There really is a sense of brotherhood that you don't see in any other line of work that I've seen. And the other thing I'll add to that, Ruth, and I appreciate you saying that because I have two very close friends I grew up with who are very angry right now because of all this. They're retired officers. One's a detective, and they really do fall in line with this concern. They're not so much, they're very concerned about the protests and the message that de Blasio is saying, and they're very vocal about it. They can be vocal because they're retired and they're posting stuff. They're very angry that the people that are working in the NYPD now, they don't think they're getting the respect, and they've seen everything, in some of the worst neighborhoods of New York City, and so they have a different lens than I do, certainly, as well.
Well, they're very insular too.
Yeah.
They're insular. It's an echo chamber, and it's not just the cops, right? I mean, it's anybody who's involved in a situation like this. Yeah.
Anyway, so we talked. I want to also start wrapping up. And Trip, I know there were two things that you wanted to talk about. One was AirAsia. If we could start with that, and then there was another report that came out about social media and how people of the same ideology get a lot of power when things are talked about on social media. Talk to us about these two things you brought to my attention, if you will.
Well, I just wanted to compliment AirAsia. We saw what happened with the Malaysian Airlines and how people were so upset with the lack of information, and it really comes back to, and as we started, rapid response does make a difference. And Tony Fernandez is the CEO for the airline, and he was quickly on scene. He was quickly consoling the families. And I think one of the most interesting things of all is that, and I'm calling this up now because I want to give you a couple examples. He has been tweeting, and he's been tweeting a few times a day, not terribly much, right? The last one here was 18 hours ago, it says here. But here is what is interesting and was so smart about this, and that is he knows his message and he's sticking to it even in his tweets. For example, the most recent one, we need to find all the parts soon. They're talking about the plane, so we can find all guests to ease the pain of the families. That is still our priority. I go back a couple more where he talks about he's going to meet the media and the people there. He talks about the fact that the family remains, here's another one, focuses finding all guests and looking after families. So he's very good about keeping people informed, and whether he's writing them or hopefully if he's not, at least approving them, the fact that the CEO is talking is going to mean, I think, a lot to people who are going to say, you know what, that airline handled it right. And that's the whole point about any crisis to me. It's not the crisis itself that's important, it's how you handle the crisis, because bad stuff is going to happen. And if you handle it well, I mean, compared to Malaysia's situation, if you handle it, AirAsia has handled it far better. And I've seen Southwest, when their airplane ran off the runway in Chicago several years ago, Kelly, their CEO, was up in Chicago as quick as he could possibly be there. Those are the kind of things that are really smart. So I think a lot of people were very critical of the crash in the Pacific, where near Australia,
Right.
and rightfully so, because of the lack of information. And I think it's really important that any organization remember, and Ruth, you said it before, if you don't talk, somebody else will. And if somebody else talks, who knows what they're going to talk about. Now, there could be extremes like Don Lemon suggesting that maybe it was a black hole that plane fell into. Most people won't buy that. But there were enough other conspiracy theories out there without the airline saying anything that people might think, well, maybe there's something to it. Maybe it was hijacked. So information is power.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that, and thanks, Trip. Really, in a crisis like this, first of all, there is no excuse for any airline CEO today not to do this right. There's so many past examples that go way back, but unfortunately, you don't have to go too far back. As you just pointed out, in just a few months, we've had a couple of these really horrible disasters from the air. The other thing is, it's not just what you say, it's what you do. And I always tell my clients, it's the actions you take and the words you say combined. So it's not enough just to say you're doing something if it's not being backed up by the actions, because the media is going to catch you if you're just talking and not taking the actions. And citizen journalists will catch you as well because of the things we talked about, right?
I agree. I just want to, my line for what you're saying is simple. Words and deeds have to match. But I also want to remind people that it's important, we talk about crisis plans, and Ruth talked about reviewing them every 6 months, which, again, I agree with. But one of the things you often have to remember is that crisis plan should maybe be called crisis guidelines, not a plan. And the reason is they're always different. And I hearken back to the plane that landed with Captain Sully Sullenberger in the Hudson River. I just showed this at a recent seminar. Pardon?
I said, so you do get New York news out there in the Midwest.
Yeah, when planes crash into the Hudson, yeah, we get that.
I was thinking the same thing, Rich.
Thank you.
Anyway, what was interesting, though, is, and I just showed this at a seminar recently, and people were aghast at it, and that was the CEO comes out, and the first thing the PR guy says is, he's really in a hurry, he's not going to answer questions, so he's just going to make a statement and go, which was too bad, because even though it was early, they knew, by the way, at this time, everybody was off the plane and everybody was safe. They knew that when he held this. And what was even worse, by the way, CNN carried it live, and I say he had to rush away, or that's what the PR guy said. At the end of it, he stands back in the back and just is chatting away with other people. He doesn't rush away at all. So it made him look bad. But here was the big problem. They got out the script that everybody died in the plane. And if you listen to the way he talked, this is a real tragedy. We're going to take care of those affected. Here's our hotline. He even asked the media not to speculate on the cause, which, by the way, is stupid. Nobody should ask the media not to speculate. They're going to speculate, period. Forget that one. Right. But anyway, if you look at that news conference that was live on CNN, it was amazing to see how they did not adapt their crisis plan to the fact that everybody lived, and never ever did he express any emotion saying thank you for, or thank goodness everybody is off the plane and is, as far as we know now, is going to be okay.
We are pleased to report everyone's okay. Right. He's going to control the dialogue.
Never did.
Great point.
Yeah.
And by the way,
one more thing, just if I could jump in, Rich, if regarding the words and deeds matching, you also got to have a pretty good company, to give you the backing for it. I understand from reading that Tony, was it Fernandez, that yes, AirAsia was a pretty safe airline. So, it made, obviously he did a good job. I completely agree with you on that. But he ran a good airline. He ran a good shop, a safe airline. That's not always the case. If you've got a lot of poor things in the background or things that have been going wrong, maybe, we talked about the GM thing the last time, Rich, right? Not such good handling over time, which is, I think, what made it worse for Mary Barra. So, lots of leadership lessons here. First of all, run a good shop. Then everything else should be easy after that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ruth. I just want to pick up on one of the things you said about having a good company. If your airline or your company has had problems before you're in the crisis that you're in right now, then you got to do your research and dig that stuff up, because if you don't, the media will. So if you say, well, we've had an incredible safety record, and then a reporter calls you on it and sees that you haven't, and you have a GM problem, or you have a problem where there were crashes, there were accidents, there were recalls, whatever the case may be, you're going to look really bad. So having key background information is going to help you in a crisis diffuse that crisis. Whether the information was good or bad, at least you have it and you can respond to it if it comes up. But you have to expect it to come up if there was something else out there. And if it happened and it was a disaster and it was in the news, it's online, so it doesn't disappear anymore.
And if your credibility is shot, so might your sales be.
Very good point. Anything else, Ruth, Tripp? Anything we talked about? I know for our viewers, thank you for watching. By the way, we've covered a lot of ground here. Any other tips or thoughts on anything we talked about tonight?
Actually, I had one more thing to say that you promoted, so I think I'll let the viewers hear about that if that's okay with you. And that is, when one of the biggest problems, and I think this is something that as crisis experts, anybody who's a crisis expert needs to start thinking about, and that is things are changing. We've talked about social media and all that. Things are changing in the United States too as we drift apart. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because you may do the right thing in a crisis and still have lots of people who don't think you did the right thing or who just don't believe you. And last night, interestingly enough, on The Daily Show, Cass Sunstein was on. He wrote a book called Wiser, and in the book, and he, by the way, is a professor at Harvard in the law school. In it, they looked at two groups in Colorado, one in Boulder, who were liberals, and another in Colorado Springs, who were conservative. And they found when they talked to each other, when I say each other, in other words, in Boulder, the Boulder liberals were just talking to the other Boulder liberals. What would happen is, and the same in Colorado Springs with the conservatives, instead of talking back and forth with each other, they were talking to their own group. They tend to become more liberal and more conservative. And the info that we'll get from each other isn't the full set of info. So even if you handle, or information, if you handle a crisis right, that information often gets filtered by, depending on the listener and what they want to believe. And you can see that sometimes with the cop situation. And what was interesting is he pointed out in the book, and it was studied, that the data, many people don't react the way you'd expect when they get data. We're talking facts, data now. And what he said was, when the data contradicts your view, the reaction is often that the data must be wrong because it's different than my belief. So you can do everything perfectly in a crisis, potentially follow the book, adapt as necessary, and still have a fail because maybe one audience looks at it one and one's another. Let me give you one fast example, and going back to Ferguson. During after the grand jury decision, to watch Fox and to watch MSNBC was watching two whole different countries, if you will. On Fox, they couldn't have supported the prosecutor, McCulloch, anymore. He did everything right. He was perfect in the way he handled it. MSNBC, they couldn't have been against him anymore. How he mishandled the whole case, how he was biased against Michael Brown, all of that. So here he had his own crisis in terms of how he handled and decided to do it. And no matter what he did, there was going to be a large group of people on the other side that weren't buying in. So I just think that's something that people have to remember, and leaders have to remember, that not everybody, if you're going to get advice, good advice from people like Ruth, for example, and it's not going to work for everybody. There's still going to be people out there who are going to be vitriolic, who are going to say nasty things about you, even though you said, and Ruth, I followed everything you said. Yeah, these people aren't listening. They don't care. The data doesn't matter. So I just want to remind people that I think that's a new area that all of us who are involved in crises need to start thinking about, and reminding the client, those leaders, things are changing. And this is a very recent change in the last few years, but it's really happening.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that. A couple of things you said. Thank you. Kind of got me thinking. Two things. Critical audiences. You can say the same thing in two different audiences and get a different result in public opinion polls, if you will, the court of public opinion. Also, just think it's interesting. You kind of reminded me as you were talking, Tripp. I'm thinking about how the world has changed. 20, 30 years ago, there wasn't a lot of difference between CBS Evening News, NBC News, and World News Tonight, except the anchor. You didn't get these ideological positions taken so extreme on either side. You got the news in a little bit different format. But really, whether it was Cronkite or Peter Jennings, anyone else, it was pretty much the same newscast almost every night, with little shades of gray maybe in some coverage of certain items. Today, as you rightly pointed out, and it's not just Ferguson, obviously, you have a whole different mentality at Fox News versus MSNBC. It's a great example. One's far to the right, one's far to the left. And CNN, I don't know how you characterize that, but we are really becoming that society, and that's being echoed on social media as well.
Well, it's the rise of opinion journalism, which has of course been exacerbated and cultivated by the internet, and so it's that's what we're left with today. I mean, people want to be emotional. They like being emotional. They like getting emotionally involved, and that's what opinion journalism enables you to do. Tripp, you were talking about things changing in people's mindset. There was an interesting op-ed an opinion, right, in the Times today, in the New York Times. Tom Friedman wrote about a time for a pause. In terms of how I'm having trouble. It's getting late in the day here. I'm having trouble in terms of how polarized people are and how they are in their sort of their own echo chambers. Whether you're a Fox person or an MSNBC person or whatever you're listening to. Rich, what you were talking about earlier is that the news used to be delivered dispassionately. You didn't know the politics of the anchors and the reporters. Now everybody wears it on their sleeve. So even
if you knew it wasn't so obvious. And
we're reaping what they've sown.
Yeah, the whole delivery of news is different, and it's entertainment now, and it's opinion, and people. To get to your point, Ruth, people do want to get emotional, but they also want to participate. I think the positive thing here is that it does give people a voice on issues that they didn't have before, and I think that's important. So,
although you're right, I call it journaltainment.
Journaltainment. That's a good one.
I like that. Yeah. So great. Thanks for bringing that to our attention, Tripp. I appreciate that. We are in a different world, and it means that our audience out there who watch the Crisis Show, you have to adjust to these trends that are changing so rapidly today. Right. So different world. And I do miss I'm an old school. I miss those old evening news broadcasts. But that was your. You got the facts for the most part. And you had correspondents who really knew their industry or knew their geographical area. And you don't get that anymore either. So.
Well, look at Walter Cronkite. He used to be the most trusted man in America in the polls. Today, no journalist would make that the top half of that list, most likely.
That's a great point. Great point.
Unless you ideologically, like for some people, Rush Limbaugh is the most trusted guy they have. And yet other people will go, oh, my goodness. So you never know.
There's a few left. There's a Scott Pelley, is one that I can think of. You just don't know much about him other than he's an on-air journalist. He's an on-air.
But he wouldn't be listed as trusted.
I don't know, Tripp.
In the same way, Walter
Cronkite. No comparison to Cronkite.
It wasn't, but it wasn't. It's a good point. But it wasn't just Cronkite. It was the way the news was delivered.
Huntley and Breckley. All of those guys. Peter Jennings.
Frank Reynolds was another one I remember on ABC. I used to like. But it wasn't just the figure. I mean, Cronkite was a giant, but it was the way that's where you got your news. People, because news is so fragmented today. For those of you watching, this is why it's so important to get your messaging right for a variety of different audiences, a variety of different channels that are watching. It's not just for one newspaper or one TV station anymore. No matter where you live, whether it's St. Louis or New York or Greenwich, it doesn't matter. People are getting the news off the internet. They're getting the news off Facebook, for God's sake, right? They're going to their news feed. That's how they're learning about what's happening in the world. So, and that's where the opinions come in. So.
I was reading Twitter while we're on the air, right? So.
Yeah, there you go. Instant news. Yeah. So. Well, guys, thank you both so much. Again, a great show. To our viewers, we're sorry for the delay. We had a little technical difficulty. You're watching this on video probably 20 years later when we have tens of thousands of views and looking back to this time capsule and say, what were they talking about? Anyway, Ruth and Tripp, thanks again. We'll do this again soon. To our viewers, thank you so much for watching. And our website is www.thecrisisshow.com. Our Twitter feed is @thecrisisshow. So thanks again, Ruth. Thanks again, Tripp. And to our viewers again, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.